please just raise your hand and he'll come around to you. We have that mic so that those who are here are able to hear as well, and as well as those who are online. So, an introduction to the parables. We'll do our best to get through the lesson. I don't want to blow through the material for the sake of just getting through. We're going to try to do the introduction today as well as lesson number 1, the parable of the sower. But we want to make sure that we do the material justice, right? That we're able to commit these things to memory, that we might be able to convince ourselves of the truth, of course, as well as when we have an opportunity to teach others, right? We always want to be able to give a good defense for the questions that are asked. So, an introduction to parables. I was talking with Beth as we were going through this study, and she thinks this is probably one of the better introductions, better explanations of what a parable is. So I hope you had a chance to read through the material. So they comprise more than a third of the recorded teachings of Jesus. The writers of the New Testament, they use allegories, similitudes, as well as we'll see things like parables. He goes on to explain that there are some things in the Old Testament we see that are parabolic stories, like in Isaiah. Who thinks they can give me a good definition of what a parable is? If you've gone through the material, it'll be pretty easy. All you got to do is read the paragraph about maybe 2/3 into the first page. Yeah, that's one definition for a parable. That's probably the one we know the most, right? It's an earthly story for a spiritual meaning is what we make the application to. We take things that you might be able to relate to in your everyday life, right? If you're going to try to teach someone a lesson, you might use something that they'd be able to identify in their daily lives. For instance, if you're talking to someone who, like I know, Ryan does some farming. So if I was a smarter man, I'd be able to get you a parable together about something that has to do with being a farmer or, tending to sheep or chickens, I know, and then try to relate that to some sort of story that I might be able to get my point across better. Jesus uses parables in a number of different ways, right? The interesting thing about when he teaches is it's not always the same story that he uses for every crowd that he comes in contact with. Did you notice that? That in different areas and different regions it might have something to do with, for instance, the parable of the sower, or when he goes to talk to those maybe in the synagogue, he'll use things like tares and other, just something that they would be able to relate to in their lives, that the idea, the lesson that he's trying to teach comes through. So he talks about things like an earthly story, for instance, with a heavenly meaning. But in Luke 23, 4 and verse 23, Ryan, if you wouldn't mind reading that here in just a second. By the above definition, he says this would have been called a proverb. Sometimes they're just done as riddles. What is there that comes out of me that is more important than what I take in? That's what the purpose of Mark 7, 15 through 17, in order to prompt the hearer to ask themselves a question. So sometimes it's just a direct statement in order to get you to understand a point, and sometimes the question is posed almost rhetorically to try to get you to ask yourself the question that you might find the answer on your own. Dennis?
4:23, and he said unto them, Ye will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country.
So why would that not be a parable?
I think maybe telling them what to do is not really something you got to think about.
Yeah, where's the story that goes along with it, right? Where's the build up to the lesson? Dennis, I don't know if you were raising your own hand to talk. You can just feel free. You've got the mic. There's no earthly story, right, that goes along with that. It's not really causing you to think too deeply. He's just telling or stating what he wants done. Julian? I don't think Dennis sees you. You got to raise it a little bit higher. There we go, nice and high.
Well, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead of the direction that you're going. But in this lesson, basically it says Jesus used this type of teaching roughly a third of the time. And the purpose of that was because the religious leaders weren't of an open heart to really hear the word directly. So he used these parables where they might listen in some regard because it's an earthly story, and whether or not they would get the spiritual principle out of it or not, most likely not. But that was the purpose of him teaching, because their hardness of heart, they were seeking to catch him in something they would say that is wrong that they could use against him. And so that was the appearance of the purpose of this type of teaching.
Yeah. The idea behind that parable, what he's using it, is the one who really wants to understand, the one who's listening to the lesson and the story, they'll get it. But for those who are just, for instance, I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with somebody who's not really listening, they're just waiting for their turn to talk. I don't know if you've ever ran into somebody who's like that. My mom, God bless her soul, that's how she is. I mean, you could talk till, the whole story's done, didn't hear a word you said, was just waiting for her turn to say the thing that she was waiting to say, right? So when you're talking in a parable and you're teaching, the one who is actually listening with an open heart, open ears, and they're looking for the purpose to learn, they're going to get it, right? But the person who's just waiting for their turn to talk, they missed the whole application of the story, thus they missed the application of the principle behind the story. They missed the earthly story, and they missed the spiritual meaning. The whole thing went out the window. I think Julian's going one more time here, Dennis.
And again, not to get ahead of the story, but even on the parable of the sower, even the apostles, I mean, after he talked about it, he later talked to them and gave them an explanation of that. So it didn't appear that they got the spiritual message out of that either,
Right.
because they had questions about it later on.
Yes. But I'll bet every time after that, they were really listening quite closely. Maybe they might have missed the first one. They didn't quite get the application. They didn't know necessarily what to look for. But then afterwards, every detail that Jesus would talk about, they would hang on that detail to look for the message, to look for the lesson, right? Sometimes you might think somebody's just telling a story for no reason. And hereafter, we'll see that Jesus is going to speak in more than a dozen parables. And they're going to pay attention to the message a little closer thereafter, right? And they're really going to start to try to dig in deep to get it. I won't get in too much into the root behind, I believe the fancy word would be called the etymology of the word. If you've had a chance to read through that, great. It's nice to know what a parable is if you break down the word. But essentially, we got the idea, right? It's to lay something beside another thing in order that they both might relate and make sense so that you can understand. So the purpose of parables, we're going to move on to page number 3. And at the top of that, we just want to make sure that we separate that. So in number 3, it talks about an allegory is like a parable, right? The story is told to make a comparison, but the difference lies in the fact that every detail in an allegory has an inner meaning. Sometimes in a parable, some of the details have a meaning, and sometimes in a parable, they're just there in order that they can kind of get you through the story, right? Some of the parts of the parable have a nice deep meaning, and sometimes they don't. But in an allegory, each individual detail, each person, each character, each place, all of them have a special meaning in that. So that would be the difference between, for instance, an allegory and a parable. One of the things they talk about is Paul's allegory. That's when he uses Sarah and Hagar, when they talk about the Old and the New Testament, the promise, and that kind of thing. And each character in there has a purpose, a meaning, okay? And sometimes we'll see, as we go throughout this study in the parables, not every character really has a deeper inner meaning to it. By the way, I saw somebody grab a lesson. Does everybody have a copy, or does anybody need one? It's going to make it hard to participate if you don't have the lesson, right? So the purpose of parables. So he says, while the New Testament does not state in so many words the exact purpose of parabolic teaching, it's implied. So discussed Julian earlier, just a moment ago, when the apostles who were with, they asked him, "Why do you teach this way?" And he answers that question. He tells them why he teaches in parables. Because the one who truly wants to learn will learn. Now, sometimes the one who truly wants to learn might need a deeper or further explanation. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe you've had that experience when you're teaching or talking to someone. They do have an open heart, they've got open ears, they want to learn, but they just need a little bit further explanation. And that's okay. That happens with me sometimes. Just ask Beth, she'll tell you. Sometimes she's got to go on a little bit further to tell me what she really, you know, I'm kind of up here and she's trying to teach me the deeper meaning or trying to tell me something else. I don't even ever run into that, but for me, just tell me what you want me to know, sometimes is the case. But he gives several reasons here for. Now, I wanted to add one more to this if you want to make a note. So there are the revelation of truth, the concealment of truth, the preservation of truth, and the elicitation of truth. One of the other reasons that I think Jesus taught in parables, and one of the reasons why they're so effective, is because of the relativity between the educated and the uneducated. Have you ever noticed that you don't have to have a PhD to understand a parable? A parable is for the smartest, I'll use that in quotation marks, right? The most highly educated, as well as maybe the person who never graduated the 3rd or 4th grade. That's the fantastic thing about a parable, and when he teaches in these stories and he uses these things in order to relate. You notice that when he's talking to farmers, he's talking about sowing seed and something that they can relate to. And you don't need to have fancy initials after your name in order to understand the purpose or the meaning of the story. So that's one of the really great things about when you teach in parables or when you're using these things. The cool thing is they related to those who we talk to, and they relate to us today. So the nice thing about that is, like I said, is it really doesn't matter your education level. Everybody can understand the teachings that Jesus, when he uses these parables, everybody can understand and relate to them. And they relate to them on a personal level. And also they have, for instance, the purpose of the revelation of truth. Sometimes they reveal more truth than a plain statement would. Why is that, you think?
I think with a parable, you can have sort of layers. You can understand it on the surface at a very basic level, or you can dig into it a little more and you can glean some more from it. So there's sort of layers of it that you can, I guess, go into.
Yeah, there's more meat really to dig into sometimes with these parables, with the stories, the similitudes, allegories, depending on how you want to look at some of them, than if I just told you. It's also sometimes easier when you're talking with someone if you just tell them. It's kind of easier for them to maybe miss the point or just ignore or even forget. You ever had somebody told you something and maybe you were like, that's amazing, and then 3 days later you can't remember a word that they said, or maybe you can't remember exactly what it was? But the story is so much easier because you can remember the bits and pieces. It's easier for you to retain that knowledge, right? And sometimes it's easy. I mean, I forget what people say all the time. I don't know about you, but if I could remember every wonderful quote that every person said, I'd probably be a smarter man today.
Thinking of this, does that tell us then how important it is that our life, the example that we show to others is? In other words, I've always kind of made a habit of looking at maybe people 15 to 20 years older than me as to how they live, the result of what they do and whatnot. So, in thinking of this, then our life is teaching, just like the example, that's the way Christ taught, is by our life, what we did.
We're told that the way that we act, the way that we conduct ourselves on a daily basis, our life is an epistle, right? We're a letter. The way that you live your life from day to day is a letter. Now that is somewhat different, obviously, than we have with the parable, where it's like a direct teaching and using a story to relate, but your story might be something that somebody relates to. We also have here the concealment of truth. Why would he want to conceal the truth? What would be the point of that, you think? I mean, if you just take a step back and you're looking at it more abstractly, why? Why would you do that? You ever have that? I see that sometimes, like with Ginny, while she's learning things, and I'm not relating adults necessarily to children, but sometimes we are when we're learning. Sometimes you just let them figure it out for themselves. You know, you let them kind of go through the motions, and then you see that moment when the light bulb goes off in their head and they get it. Sometimes the concealment of truth is so that the person who's trying to learn the lesson might be the one who uncovers it. And it's much more impactful that way for them. It's not the case every time, right? But sometimes it's better for people to just learn it for themselves.
It was just, as you were saying that, I was thinking, you know, the parable that we're talking about today. How many of those people heard that, and then years later, they see someone who appears to understand and then just leaves? That's what Jesus was talking about when he said that. There's going to be people that the cares of the world are going to choke out the gospel.
Yeah.
That's what he meant.
Thorny soil. Well, you know, maybe it'll click, you know, maybe in a few years later. Or stony. Or maybe it was the good soil. You know, sometimes that application doesn't reveal itself, maybe even for a little bit of time. But the point of that parable is to be impactful on that person's life. And sometimes it's much more impactful this way than a direct statement ever could be, right? The preservation of truth. So parables are set forth in a vivid, striking form which commands attention and to impress the memory, thus making them easy to recall. That's the fancy word for the way I just said it a moment ago, right? It makes it easier to remember sometimes a story than it does just a statement. Their use is especially beneficial to those who are just beginning to study the spiritual things. Yeah? What do you think about that? You think it's good maybe if you're just starting to sit down and study, maybe with a new Christian, to maybe start in the parables? Could that be useful? Or maybe with somebody who's not obeyed the gospel yet, and you maybe want to start with the parable of the sower. I heard a guy one time, he said, well, I like to start in the book of Revelation, because if they can understand that, they can understand anything. Sometimes it's easier to start on the milk or the stories that people can easily relate to, they can recall, they can uncover the truth for themselves. Johnny Edwards did a Bible study many years back, and it's about a person uncovering the real church. And it's kind of this progression in each lesson. In each lesson, a little bit more is uncovered, so that by the end, the Baptist or the Catholic or the Methodist would come to the realization that the church that I attend is not the church of the New Testament. Now I get it, right? So sometimes it's just that progression, and it's easier to do it that way.
Well, and when you said that, it makes me think, you know, starting with Revelation, I mean, that's kind of like when you start teaching a child, what do? We draw pictures, because pictures is what they can see. When they add math, they draw pictures and they add, you know, that you can't just tell them to write 530, you know, I mean, you have to start them out in a way, and we are such visual people because we don't know what heaven looks like. We don't know what all this stuff, so there are some people just by nature, I'm a very visual learner, like I have to see it, I can't just memorize it, and like I can't learn it. So, I mean, we all have learning different styles, and obviously God, Jesus, I mean, they knew that. Mm-hmm. We have to be creative in our teaching, and I think this is just one of those ways in God's wisdom.
Yeah. Not everybody, you know, when you're, especially like we were talking about when you're teaching young kids, you don't just say, you know, 6 + 6 is 12. You say, well, there's 6 seashells, and little Susie finds 6 more seashells, and they got a picture of Susie, and she's picking them up on the beach, and the kid, you know, they remember that, they relate to that. And just like the information in the parable, they relate to that, they remember that. So you're painting a vivid picture for them. Dennis Jean has a comment.
Yeah, I can remember that when I was going to the Baptist church, of course, I was real young, and I went along with everything. I mean, I thought everything was okay. But then when my grandfather, when I was visiting with him on the farm, he said, I've got a couple of questions I'd like for you to ask your preacher. And he gave me the scripture. So the next Sunday, I took the Bible and I took those scriptures and I asked the preacher, I said, what does that teach? Well, he told me, and I said, but that's not what it says. But Gene, this is what it's preaching. So then I got to thinking, even today, because I was reading the Bible. I mean, you know, I was reading and reading and reading. Why didn't I see that? But what it was is the preacher, as he was preaching and waving his Bible and whatnot, he was not really taking the scripture and discussing the scripture to where I could pick up on that. And that was very revealing.
Yeah, and sometimes when you lay it out there with those, it makes it difficult to ignore the truth, for instance, of the scripture. I mean, when you're really digging into the deep meaning of it, or if maybe you're just looking at it for exactly what it says. Not everything needs, to be dug away underneath and really have a deep dive in. Sometimes the Bible's just very clear in its language. Do this. And then sometimes you have to read the scriptures and you've got to go a little bit deeper. Sometimes you've got to read the parable and you've got to try to understand what it means. Sometimes there's plain language. So you really have to be able to approach it from a lot of different angles. And we have here the elicitation of truth for those who would otherwise be reluctant to acknowledge it. Who thinks I can sum that up in maybe more layman terms? The elicitation of the truth. You're right. Here's how I like to do this. Well, you get them to admit when they were wrong. There you go. I mean, if you really want to know what that sentence right there says, you get them to admit they're wrong. They come to the realization they were wrong. Okay? Sometimes a parable, that's what the purpose of it is. It's so the truth cannot be ignored, such as when he was talking to David. The truth can't be ignored. It's so obvious by the time it's done, there's no arguing against it, right? Understanding parables. It's impossible to lay down strict rules for understanding parables. I'd agree with that. There's nothing that says a parable has to be exactly, these three elements and that's all it ever consists of. Sometimes it's more than that, right? Sometimes some of the different characters and all of them have a specific meaning, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the lesson's much more difficult to understand. If you remember, there were some times when Jesus would teach, and the response was, these things are just too hard to understand, and all the people would leave. And then sometimes he would teach, and sometimes everybody would get it, and they would all have a good response to it. So I want to, if you had an opportunity to finish the rest of this, that's great. We're going to jump into the parable of the sower. We've got about maybe 15 minutes here, and I think we can do that. Does anybody have any questions, comments on what a parable is? Do you feel like we missed something? We need to do a deeper dive? You can only beat a dead horse so long as far as that goes. So we're going to jump into the parable of the sower. So I'll read it quickly, and then we'll get into the questions. The same day went Jesus out of the house and sat by the seaside, and a great multitude were gathered together unto him, so that he went into a ship and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them. Some fell upon stony places, where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them, but others fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, and some 30-fold. He who hath ears, let him hear. And the disciples came unto him and said, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? And he answered unto them and said, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whosoever hath, to him it shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him it shall be taken away, even that he hath. Therefore I speak unto them in parables, because they see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear it with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. So, through this parable, you may not be able to answer the first question. In what part of Palestine was this parable spoken? And do you think it has any particular significance, right, to the relation of the content in the parable? Explain your answer. Julian, I'm going to call on you first because you told me you had your homework done. I asked you outside. You said, I got it all done. So we'll crack there with you first. What do you think about this?
Well, as far as exactly where it was, I didn't really think to look into that. I mean,
Sea of
I
Galilee.
would think it wouldn't be in Jerusalem. It would probably be in the outer areas, more in farming area, where these people would be used to what he's talking about, more like farmers and what you just said.
Yeah.
So anything else you're going to put me on the spot on?
But why do you think that he uses this particular parable in that region? You kind of touched on it. You said because it might have been out towards maybe a more farming, a little bit more rural area, right?
I thought it was up by Capernaum. I thought it was interesting that he uses a story of a sower in what probably would have been around a fishing area. But nevertheless, they were agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
So the people this would have related to them also. I think they might have been more uneducated than people of the city, like Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And
More
just
educated in terms of, more educated. Sometimes
yeah, I know.
Sometimes that means different things, right?
But I think it would have been a simple kind of
Yeah.
fishing agricultural town and a simple story to go with it.
Yeah. So I looked this up, right? I tried to find out. And turns out you can take a tour of the exact spot where this took place. Did you know that? For just a couple of $1,000s, they'll take you and you can sit exactly where Jesus got on the boat. Does anybody really know where that was? Yeah. And when you're done, the Nigerian prince will help you move his $3 million worth of gold right over to your U.S. bank account for just a small share. We don't really know exactly where this spot was, do we? We have kind of a general idea, maybe where he was, kind of in the region. He was up on the Sea of Galilee. As he got into a boat there, and he went and taught because there were so many people. The idea that, at least from what I saw or was able to ascertain from the folks who were trying to take me on the tour there, is that there was a really rocky terrain, and that they would understand this parable of the sower because they had to remove tons of rocks from the soil in order to be able to plant. And so they would have understand kind of the stony ground portion of the the parable of the sower, where if you didn't get all those rocks out of there, the roots couldn't get very deep and they just hit a rock bed, and then they'd spring up and they'd be scorched by the sun. And then, of course, they had some different, it was, like you said, an agriculture, kind of more of a trading area. So they had the waysides, they had the paths where people would walk the paths nice and flat. And so since it was by the sea and there were paths, the seed would fall on that path. And then the fowls from the sea, you know, seagulls or whatever kind of birds, they'd come down, swoop, and they'd eat that seed. So the whole point of it is, whether we know all the details or not, they would have been familiar with all of the things that were part of this parable. Would have been familiar with stony ground. They would have been familiar with the birds of the sea, so they'd understand the idea behind the fowls coming down to swoop up the seed. Anybody who's farmed for very long or who's done any measure of farming knows you've got to work the land before you put the seed in the ground. You can't just go out and just start throwing seed into a field and then you're going to get, you know, a really great crop. You've got to take out the weeds. You've got to take out the thorns. You've got to take out the thistles. You got to remove tree stumps. You've got to prepare the land in order to make your seed grow, your crop grow. So there's 4 types of soil that he refers to in the parable. What are the 4 types? Well, so you gave me which one? The wayside, the stony, the good, yeah, and then there was the thorny, right? So there were the 4 types of soil that were referred to. So when it fell by the wayside, what happened? So what's a wayside, by the way, in case you're not familiar with it?
This. It's
Okay.
the side of the road.
Side of the road?
I would think it's something more impacted, it would have been a travel, like a lane, like out by our garden.
Yeah. Yeah, you ever seen that when maybe animals out in the field, they walk a certain path and not a thing is going to grow there. So if you know, if you farm for very long, for instance, that you've kind of got to rotate your livestock, or otherwise they will walk that land totally flat and no grass will grow there again. So a wayside is a walking path. Okay, so it's something that's been trampled down, a place that people go, and talking about the seed that would fall on that. If seed falls on that type of path, it's not going to take root. The ground is just too hard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And stony soil. Boy, if you live in Indiana, you probably know about this. What do you think of stony soil is? You ever got that real nice black dirt for about the first 1 or 2 inches? And then all of a sudden your shovel gets a little bit harder to get into the ground because you're hitting nothing but rocks underneath? That's not good for plants. I don't know if you know this, but if you garden, your tomatoes aren't going to grow very well, for instance, in an area like that. You've got to get all of those rocks out of there. You got to dig in. You got to put that nice fresh dirt back in there. But that would be the stony soil, right? Thorny? I don't think we need to go into kind of understand what soil full of thorns looks like. And then the good. So he asked what were the various reactions to the parable. Some understood and some didn't. Some needed maybe further explanation. We see that his apostles, his disciples, they came to him and said, "Why do you teach this way?" And then later on they say, "What's the meaning of this?" And then he goes into a deep dive explanation. The seed is the word of God. This is this type of soil, and here are these people. In fact, there are times even when Jesus teaches and he says, "You're the teachers of today and you don't understand this parable? How could you be the ones who are educating the people and you don't understand something so simple as what this parable is? How could you not make the connection?" There are times when he goes into an explanation of exactly what it is, and there are sometimes when the people, they just don't get it and they leave. So he asked, why was Jesus speaking in parables? Remember the answer he gave in Matthew there?
Basically, he says it wasn't time for everyone to get this.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I don't know, we could say the primer. It's not, what is it? It's not given to them to understand. It's not time yet.
Yeah. You understand, but it's not their time to get it yet. And who knows, maybe some of the people, one of the things I heard a fellow say a while ago, he said, no today doesn't mean no tomorrow. Because they didn't get it today doesn't mean they might not get it later. So he speaks in parables because the ones who want to hear will understand, and the ones who don't, well, they won't get it. It also fulfills the prophecy of the prophet Isaiah, right? It says he'll be speaking in parables, and with their ears they will not hear because their wax grows. They don't want to listen. I've been that person. Sometimes people, they want to teach me a lesson, and I'm just not trying to hear it because I think I'm right. I think I know better. I know best. But ignoring the simple truth behind what that person is trying to tell me. That's just like the folks he was talking about in this story. Some of them, they're going to hear my words. They hear me talking, but they're not listening. They're just not getting it because they don't want to. And then the folks who really do, they'll get it. So what does the seed represent? He has to go on to explain to him, doesn't he? What's the seed?
Well, the seed's the word, but I was going to say there's two things that are constant. There's dynamic and static in this.
Mm-hmm.
And then two things that are constant are the sower sows the seed, and the seed's known good. And then there's variables, which is the soil and the conditions of the soil. But we know the seed is good. It doesn't change, and the sower has a responsibility. He does his job regardless. The two standards, and then you have the variables of the soil.
So our job is to be the sower. You do your job. The Word of God is good. You sow, and you're not responsible for. So you ever seen somebody who sows seed? It's not like today, where they got GPSs and there's lanes and there's $500,000 tractors and that's not what sowing is. Does anybody know what a sower, what that means? Just to sow seed? You're just taking it and you're just throwing it out wherever it goes. And you're just spreading the seed. Kind of, I don't know, that's how I used to do grass seed. I don't have one of those little fancy machines, that does it for me. I just go out there and I just start throwing it over there till it looks like the ground is covered. And then I hope maybe grass will grow there. That's what a sower. Our job is to be the sower. We spread the seed. Are you responsible if a person obeys the gospel or not? Who's the onus on, you or them? Yeah, you sow the seed, not your seed, the Word of God, His seed. You sow that, and you leave it up to them whether they'll respond or not.
I was thinking as you were saying that, anyone who's ever stood up front and done a lesson or everything has had this where, especially when you're younger, you think, man, this is great. I have done this just right. I've said it so plainly. They will be lining up to be baptized after I get done with this lesson.
I'll have to beat them off with a stick, right?
Yeah. And you think about the people that were listening to him, listening to Jesus. These were the early adopters, I guess you could say. These were the people that were going to go out, and they were going to have to realize that most people aren't going to care. It doesn't matter how good of a job you do. I mean, in this parable, 75% of the people didn't.
Didn't get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not every place you sow the seed is going to bear fruit. Okay. But Jesus is teaching us here that you sow the seed anyway. And you continue to sow the seed. And you keep sowing. And even if, 1 out of 4 gets it today when you sow, fine, do it again. And 1 out of 4 will get it then. And then 1 out of 4. And then by the time you know, you've converted at least 3 people, right? It's not always the way with the numbers, but not everybody's going to listen. Did everybody listen to Jesus? I mean, he was the master teacher. Did everybody obey? Yeah. I can't teach better than he. Can you? And yet look at how many people even turned away while they were listening to the sound of his voice, not reading the written word, they could hear the sound of his voice. And yet they still obeyed not. So if you take anything away from the lesson of the parable of the sower is, sow the seed, do the work, and you let that seed grow, right? Paul said, we planted, Apollos watered, and who gave the increase? Let God give the increase. You let the word do what the word is supposed to do with them. Your job is just to sow it with your children, with your family, with your coworkers, whomever. And not everybody's going to get it. We understand. I do. I didn't get it first time I heard either, but eventually I came around, right? Keep sowing. Let the seed grow. So we'll have lesson number 2. I have no idea who's teaching that lesson, as I have not seen the list. But if you're going to be ready for that, it's the parable of the unmerciful servant. If you haven't read through this one, there's a lot of application to be made in that lesson. So I appreciate your good attention, appreciate your good study and comments. We'll have service starting in just a few minutes here.